So hey, everybody. Thanks so much for tuning into this month's webinar. I'm Emily Whitmore. I'm the resident social scientist at MAIC, and I'm really excited to give an overview of our most recent project, a guide to social license to operate for shellfish and seaweed aquaculture in Maine. So this project was made possible by our funders, World Wildlife Fund, who's working here and in the US and globally to advance low trophic aquaculture. So just a few housekeeping things to take care of while people are still trickling in. First, I want to plug next month's seminar that'll be held on September 15th from 12 to 1 p.m. We're excited to have Tom Kifney from the University of Maine as our speaker, and he's going to be presenting on some data sources that can be used by farmers for site selection. So keep an eye out for that flyer with the registration link. I want to quickly apologize if any of you received some confusing emails yesterday about the webinar. Initially, we were using the same registration link for our entire webinar series, but now we're using a unique link for each webinar. So this way you only get reminders for the webinars that you sign up for. So those are kind of auto-generated emails canceling the other webinars, but they will be happening. Also, Sydney is going to be switching through slides for me today. I had a little, we were talking about how this is kind of a funny story, but this morning I had a delivery driver come in and almost take down my Spectrum line. So it's hanging across my driveway right now. I still have internet, but for whatever reason, when I'm sharing my screens, the screen gets all wiggly. So we're going to have Sydney do that. So Sydney, next slide. So Seaweed is coming up in September, September 6th and 7th, right here in Portland. So if you haven't registered for this yet, this QR code link gives you 10% off the registration costs. And I want to highlight one of the speakers, Sebastian Bell of MAA. He's giving a talk on my favorite subject, social license. And I think that does it. I'm going to start with a brief overview of what social license is, and then I'll get into our project specifically. So I don't plan on taking up the full hour. I'll probably talk like 35 or 40 minutes, and then I'll leave the rest open for questions. So if you have any questions throughout the seminar, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We have Sydney and Annie. They'll be monitoring the questions. I'm going to take a brief pause after I introduce the social license concept just to check in and see if we have any questions, and then we can go through the rest of questions about the guidebook at the end. All right, next slide. So I wanted to start out just by framing this project. So we know that aquaculture is becoming critically important for global food security. So as a result of this, we've seen significant effort being put into expanding the industry, specifically here in the US, where we still import about 85% of our seafood. So with this growth, however, comes new challenges, one of which is figuring out how to coexist with communities and other ocean users. Public opposition has become a real barrier to growth here in Maine for both for farms that are both small and large. So social science plays an important role here in better understanding how the industry can kind of grow in a way that's socially sustainable, where both communities and farmers benefit. So I'm using a concept that's been gaining traction in the aquaculture world recently called social license to operate. Though it's used most in an industry setting, as kind of an industry tool, I've been thinking about social license as really a tool for socially sustainable development. Go ahead, next slide. So the term social license to operate originated in the mining industry as a way of describing the informal ongoing approval or acceptance of a project that's granted by the community. So mining companies across the globe were seeing really varied community reactions to their projects. So in some cases, communities embrace the mining activity, even incorporating it into their identity like a mining town. But in others, where communities were seeing really negative environmental impacts, or in some cases were being relocated against their will, they were seeing these community members organize in protests, at times effectively shutting down the mining operations. So a mining executive from Vancouver started describing this as social license to operate, which is a continuum that captures community support for a project. So I have a simplified scale of social license here on this slide, and I just want to point out that tolerance or simply lack of opposition doesn't mean you have social license. So social license is really about active support for a project, where community members are aware and engaged. So when you have full social license, you reach the point where the community psychologically identifies with the activity, like I said, a mining town or a fishing town, and will actively protect that industry if threatened. And social license is dynamic, so it can change. So companies must work consistently to gain and maintain that community support. Go ahead, next slide. So social license is centered around trust, and researchers have been able to statistically link several company actions to social license through trust. So quality communication has been consistently linked to social license through trust across industries. And this is specifically quality. The interactions have to be meaningful. So quantity alone does not influence social license. Distributional fairness, or whether the public thinks that the benefits of the activity are evenly distributed, that helps to generate trust, which builds social license. Procedural fairness, or whether community members feel like they had a say in the process, that's also been shown to build trust. Positive cultural impacts has been shown, has been linked to trust specifically in aquaculture. And then general impacts on social infrastructure has also been shown to build trust, which helps generate social license. So again, this research is across industries. So it includes mining, forestry, energy sectors, and aquaculture. We'll get into aquaculture specifically, but generally gaining social license is the result of earning trust from your stakeholder network. And this is done primarily through on-the-ground relationship building between the company and the community. Next slide. So in an industry context, social license is often presented as a tool that businesses can use to gain security. So it's described as a way of managing social risk. So it's preventative. By doing the outreach and communicating with stakeholders, you're able to reduce potential opposition. But beyond these preventative benefits, there are also protective benefits to social license, as I mentioned earlier. So when a community actively supports an industry and incorporates it into their identity, there's evidence that communities will act with the company's best interests in mind, like fighting for industry-friendly regulations or blocking moratoriums. Next slide. And social license can also work to benefit the wider industry through increased positive public perceptions. So social license and public perceptions are often used interchangeably, but social license work is hyper-local and it focuses on the relationship between the company and the community. Public perceptions or social acceptability, that's about broader public perceptions, and it's not directly linked to a particular farm, though a particular farm can certainly influence opinions. Where they're related is through experience. So the positive experiences that are created through social license work, it can help to move the needle on public perceptions more broadly. And then these positive public perceptions can make gaining social license easier for farmers. So this is how they're kind of intertwined. Right, next slide. So social license also functions as a community empowerment tool. So by being able to withhold or issue social license, communities have more say over what happens to their resources. So it provides kind of a sense of environmental security. And this is especially true when thinking about really environmentally impactful industries. Communities can also influence how they want companies to act, directly or indirectly. And we'll talk about how this plays out in aquaculture later in the presentation. And lastly, they can pressure governing officials to change regulations, either in support of or to restrict development. So we're seeing this now with the introduction of moratoriums on aquaculture along the coast of Maine. So the success of these moratoriums depends on community support for the industry. And this support is often a result of local farmers doing the social license work that builds that support. All right, next slide. So while social license has been pretty well studied in the industries like mining, we're just starting to really understand how it looks in aquaculture. So aquaculture, it's unique because it produces food, which is more accessible and tangible compared to like mining precious metals. And it has environmental benefits. So, but what makes social license relevant to aquaculture is that farms are primarily sited in shared waters. So community involvement and support is imperative for a farm's success. So we limited this project to Maine and focused on shellfish and seaweed farmers. but we were really interested in how they were incorporating social license practices in their businesses, how they were thinking about social license, and what strategies they were using to try to gain social license from their communities. So the goal of the project was to create a guidebook for farmers that outlined practical ways that they could engage meaningfully with their communities in order to gain that genuine community support. All right, next slide. So just an overview of the project. We decided early on that this project would be way better if it were co-created with farmers. So we started with interviews with 30 shellfish and seaweed farmers. And then after thematically coding and analyzing, we sent out our findings in a draft format to the participating farmers for feedback and edits. And this was super valuable. So not only did many of the farmers give some really substantive feedback on the draft, but they pointed out small errors that only farmers would know, like terminology stuff. And they also provided some amazing photos, some of which have been are in this presentation. But we included those in the guidebook as well as our infographic series. So just a bit more on our methods. Our sampling process, I think, was a real strength of this project. We were able to randomly select farmers from DMR's lease and license holders list. So in Maine, we have a really active group of farmers that will collaborate on research often, which is amazing. But this sampling method gave us a kind of a broader range of voices. We did stratify by lease or license type. So we included both LPA holders and the experimental and standard lease holders. We stratified by regions. So we looked at Southern, Mid-Coast, and Down East Maine, and then also product type with shellfish and seaweed. So the final outputs for the project are a full detailed guidebook that goes through all the themes that were found in our farmer interviews. I used a ton of farmer quotes, so it's really their voices that are driving the guide. And then I wove in some prior social license research that kind of helps to ground their stories. And we also have an executive summary that's shorter. And then we have a series of one-page infographics, front and back, that talk about specific topics. So far we have Social License 101, Getting Started, and Trust Generating Practices. And we're working on one about dealing with conflict, and then another that dives into what is community and looks at like talking with different stakeholder groups. So these are all going to be available on our website, which is this QR code that you see in the top right. Some of the infographics are already up on the website, and everything else should be posted within the next week or so. And I'll also make sure that this link is included when we post the video. So I'm going to go through and talk about some of the results from the study. Just another reminder, if we have any new people that have joined, feel free to ask questions using the Q&A function. We have Annie and Sydney, they're monitoring, and they can interrupt me whenever. They might save some for the end though, so don't worry if you don't hear yours right away. But do we have any? I can't actually see it right now, so I'm not sure if we have any questions so far. Let's see, I don't see any so far, so I'm going to keep going. All right, next slide. All right, so just an overview of main themes included in the guidebook. We have the importance of learning and integrating, so learning about your community and integrating into that community. We have education as engagement, or how farmers incorporate education into their outreach strategies. We have trust generating practices, which outline specific ways farmers are building trust with their stakeholders. And we have how farmers are dealing with conflict and opposition. Okay, next slide. So first, all Maine farmers discussed the importance of knowing the landscape physically and socially, and being able to kind of seamlessly integrate into that landscape. So this process of learning and integrating, it showed up in two main ways. First was really during the planning stage when farmers talked about site selection. And then the second was when describing their approach with their host community, how they were consciously trying to kind of blend in with the existing working waterfront. Next slide. So thinking about that first avenue, for farmers, site selection had as much to do with the growing conditions as it did the social fabric and the culture of the community that their site was in. And this is core social license stuff. So they acknowledge that identifying and connecting with all relevant stakeholders is a key part of early acceptance during planning and permitting. And neglecting stakeholder groups, whether it's intentional or not, can be really detrimental for gaining social license. In Maine, these stakeholder groups included other ocean users like lobstermen, coastal landowners, town officials, and more broadly, interested community members. They also talked about how knowing what was important to the local community was really important to their own success. So a great example of this is from Jody's farm. She's a seaweed farmer up in mid-coast Maine, and she's from an island community, an island fishing community. And she told me that they started their farm as a way of helping fishermen who had lost shrimping. So they hired fishermen exclusively, and they worked closely with the local lobstering community to time their seeding. And they also left their farm open for fishing year round, even though they didn't have to. When they faced public pushback from a really small group of seasonal residents at their lease hearing, who were arguing that it would actually displace the fishermen, quote, all stood up and said, not going to hinder us. We think this is great. And it's because they knew what was important to the local community, they were able to kind of align their operation with what was valued locally and offer something meaningful to those living there. Next slide. So it's important to note that Jody grew up in her island community, so it was easier for her to know what was important to the locals. But if you're from away, as we say in Maine, or if you're even from a different town in Maine, this process can be much more difficult. So farmers that I spoke to who were farming in sites where they weren't living or weren't from identified a few strategies for overcoming this barrier. So there was a slow route and then there's a fast route. The slow route is organic integration, where you ease your way into the industry with the local community. So this quote is from a farmer who worked in the seafood industry for like 30 years before starting his farm. And it was really beneficial for him when he went to get a lease. By that time, he'd built up a good amount of credibility with other folks in the industry. So he says, well, look, go down to South Bristol and be a sternman on a lobster boat. And if you're a good worker, you'll do well, you can make money too. And if he's happy with you and all that, you start getting credibility in that fishing community. We'll do that for a few years, then you become part of that community. So when you want to say, hey, I want to try this other thing, but it means I have to lease some space, then maybe you've learned enough about where everybody is setting their lobster gear, because you don't want to make stupid mistakes either, like pick a spot where everybody fishes in the middle of shedder season. So anyways, the real point is, I feel like that's an important thing to do. But this type of slow integration really isn't feasible for everybody. And frankly, being non-native shouldn't be a barrier to entry if we want to have an equitable industry. But it's important to acknowledge that, especially here in Maine, where there's a lot of pride surrounding being a Mainer, the experience of being from away differs, and it might require a different approach for farmers. So the faster route involves seeking out gatekeepers. And several farmers said that if you don't know the area, find someone who does. And specifically, farmers found that connecting with other local established farmers, fishermen, and harbor masters was most helpful in getting information about key stakeholders in their area and learning who they should connect with. Next slide. So education as engagement was really important for Maine farmers, and this comes up constantly. We've run a handful of social license workshops, and we always end up discussing education and awareness. So we know from the survey research that knowledge and awareness of aquaculture is incredibly low, even in coastal communities. And because of this, there's a lot of uncertainty and fear. So Joanna captured this in her quote. She said, Mainers know fishing, they get that. It's kind of in our blood. We can picture it and we romanticize about it. It's what our grandfathers did. And sea farming is kind of something scary. It's just different. We don't know what it looks like. And I heard that again and again. People just don't know what it looks like. So this is a real challenge. And this lack of knowledge can be kind of exacerbated by a few different factors. So first is when the public's limited experience and knowledge about aquaculture or aquaculture related activities is negative. So Elijah, who's a kelp farmer, he talked about how he tried to apply for an LPA in a community that had a negative experience with a research project that was collecting data related to like a kelp biorefinery site. So it wasn't even a farm. It was just a single data collection buoy that was out in the bay, but nobody had told the town about it. Legally, they didn't have to, but the locals were upset that they weren't consulted with. So when Elijah went to go apply for his LPA, they were initially super resistant to his proposal because of that experience. he said, quote, they were like, kelp, nope, no way, not here. So another challenge is when the knowledge gaps are filled with misinformation. So Dan said, communities that are unfamiliar with aquaculture are, quote, very susceptible to the gaslighting that's going on because they really don't know. All they know is what they're being told by the anti-aquaculture people. Next slide. So in response to this, farmers incorporated education into every part of their outreach. So in planning and permitting, this looked like providing information packets, slides, visuals. They'd hold information sessions, and they spent tons of time talking to folks about aquaculture and their farm. Going back to Elijah, so in response to the pushback he received for his kelp LPA, he just took the time to explain his operation without being dismissive of their concerns. And by the end, they were much more receptive to his project. So he said, I was like, listen, it's just 2 small lines. I understand these people came in and dropped their mooring here for a data collecting buoy without your permission, but I'm coming here to talk to you about it. This is what I'm doing. It's small. This is my boat. I fish around people in your community too. I'm not trying to be some large corporate investment firm coming in and taking up your bottom. And then it was a good conversation after that. It's just understanding any apprehension people might have to aquaculture and listening to them fully before you get defensive. So lastly, as a way of combating misinformation, farmers said to be proactive so that you're the one filling those knowledge gaps. Scott said, quote, be the one to tell people your side of the story before they hear somebody else's side. All right, next slide. So the next theme, which is central to social license in the research, is trust. When I asked farmers about trust generating practices, I got some answers that I expected, like the importance of communication, but I also got a bunch of answers that were really surprising to me as a land farmer. They were really aquaculture specific, which speaks to the importance of investigating social license within industries. And farmers, I realized farmers were talking about 2 different types of trust. So the first is integrity-based trust, which is really about like moral, ethical alignment. And then the second is competence-based trust, which is whether they trust that you know what you're doing. So farmers' actions contributed to one or both forms of trust. Next slide. Okay, so here's the grand list of themes that came up. I'm going to go through each one of these bins. So communication, operational practices, and then community. So the percentages on the right here, this is the percent of farmers who brought up the action organically in interviews. So not whether they do it. So you can see like abiding by regulations says 14%. More than 14% of farmers are obviously abiding by regulations, but 14% of farmers brought up abiding by regulations as specifically a trust generating practice. All right, next slide. So starting with communication, these were the themes that I expected to see based on previous research. So we have voluntary interaction, which I define as interaction that's not legally mandated by the permitting process. So all farmers did that, especially during planning and permitting, but beyond that as well. So Hugh said, well, I think it's not just following the requirements of the license, which is riparian landowners. It's thinking of your constituencies and anybody that might be impacted by it. So I think our strategy was to talk to everybody we could get our hands on and to make it very public and do personal contact with the right people, fishermen and landowners. So also expected was being honest and transparent. So about 31% of farmers brought this up, and this has been found across industries. So Brian said, I think it's all about communication and transparency. You know, I think it's important to talk about your goals, the goals of your farm, what you're long-term looking to achieve. So it's one thing to say, oh, hey, I'm just opening up a single LPA when you're planning on putting 5 acres in 2 years. So I think that's important. So consulting and making accommodations was also expected and was cited by 35% of farmers. So this is when farmers made real changes based on community feedback. So Bob, a seaweed farmer, gave a great example of this. So after getting a bit of grief from the local lobstering community, a community that he was actually part of, he agreed to take out his moorings in the off season. He said, quote, "It's a significant investment in all the anchors and lines, but it just allows me to be there during my lease time. It keeps everybody happy." So changes made based on public feedback is tangible evidence that you care about your community and you want to be a good neighbor. And this evidence builds trust. All right, next slide. So moving on to operational practices, this is where trust generating actions got really aquaculture specific, which is super interesting. So the first theme was about reducing impacts. So I struggled with categorizing this at first. I was trying to capture this minimization that was motivated by farmers wanting to avoid negative impressions. So they were trying to not to be noticed for the wrong reasons. And I thought this was really interesting because it demonstrates how aware farmers are that they are trying to enter into a space that's been dominated by industries like lobstering and fishing for generations. So they know that this is new, and they talked extensively about how people don't know what aquaculture looks like. So any negative attention could be really detrimental to growth at this point. So they're trying to slot themselves in organically alongside these other industries in a way that doesn't draw negative attention, that feels really natural. So this first farmer talked about using a plastic sorter to keep the noise down, even though it's slower. Another talked about switching to bottom culture to reduce negative impacts caused by lost gear or other accidents. So this contributes to both forms of trust. So stakeholders were being conscientious and respectful of others, and this could help build that integrity-based trust. But also by reducing their impacts and those negative impressions, stakeholders might be more confident in their abilities as farmers, which would contribute to that competence-based trust. And I do want to point out that there are varying degrees of reducing impacts. So it might not be economically feasible to use a slower sorter for some of the larger operations, but even large operations found ways to reduce impacts. Like even small adjustments, like not playing music before 8 a.m. might make a social impact. So it all depends on your specific operation and the community that you're working with. All right, next slide. So along similar lines, farmers brought up the importance of keeping their farm tidy. So Chris said here that one of the most important trust building practices is keeping a tidy farm. So I'd say leaving our workflow ship shape. So we hose off all the shell and slime and everything, and the tumbler, all the wood parts are painted white. We take a sponge and hose off all the mud, and it looks like a brand new tumbler. The culling table has mud all over it. We hose it off, sponge it down, sponge off the legs and everything. We pack all the bags in tight underneath. All the orange crates get stacked and pushed aside. Everything's tight, ship shape, nothing's flapping and dragging around. So if somebody comes by when we're gone, it looks like a well-kept workflow. So I almost included this code in minimization, but it was so distinct, and almost 40% of farmers brought this up specifically, which I wasn't expecting. And it wasn't necessarily about avoiding negative attention, like the reducing impacts theme. It was really a way of building competence-based trust that farmers know what they're doing. And this wasn't just about the aesthetics either. Farmers talked about how it's an important way of reducing hazards to other users too. So key trust generating practice is keeping your farm tidy. Next slide. So another way farmers built this form of trust was simply by being visible. So farmers talked about how stakeholders would see them out on the water every day, working hard. And this goes back to that value alignment that we talked about. So seeing them working built that confidence that they know what they're doing, but it also resonated with how we value hard work. And this is one of the ways Alicia built rapport with her riparian landowners. She said, they see me working from that mooring field. They could see me in the morning dragging my bags down in my generator, and they see me when I'm coming in at sunset dragging coolers or bins of oysters up on the dock. Abiding by regulations was also brought up as a trust building practice. So Amanda said those regulations are there for a reason. So put the reflective tape on, make sure people know that it says Sea Farm and your name and where it is. So this again contributes to that competence-based trust because you're showing the public that you know the regulations, but it also contributes to integrity-based trust. So like Charlie said here, we're rule followers in almost every regard, or in most every regard. Next slide. So tangible community benefits are also super important in generating social license. So when you're operating in common pool resources, in order to gain support, community members need to feel like they're getting something out of it. So we know that many forms of aquaculture provide benefits to the ecosystems. It helps fight climate change, and it's it's part of the broader solution to food security. But these are really intangible for some people. So farmers used a variety of strategies to provide meaningful and tangible benefits to community members. So first, farmers used the product itself as a way of connecting and building relationships with stakeholders. So some talked about how selling locally was a key part of trust building, whether through pop-up sales or sales at local restaurants. Others talked about how they'd give away free or discounted products to neighbors. This was super common. And this is an important community benefit, especially when you're working with riparian landowners. So these landowners are typically wealthy. Some only live there seasonally. And the benefits of aquaculture that are often in the spotlight, like how they contribute local jobs, those benefits don't resonate with landowners who don't necessarily need those jobs. So they're experiencing the greatest impacts like visually, but they aren't benefiting directly. So some farmers talked about texting their neighbors occasionally and hanging bags of oysters for them off their docks. And this was a really effective way of engaging. Farmers also talked about filling community needs as an important community benefit. So serving on committees, participating in local schools, or even like coaching local sports teams. These were all opportunities for farmers to become more integrated and known within their communities. So Dan, whose team faced some real challenges during their lease expansion, said that the local support was a huge help during that process, and that they had that support because, quote, people knew their character. And this was because they were well integrated in their community. But also, this action fills a real need. So committees need members and teams need coaches. So farmers found that to be a really effective way of building trust because people saw that they were genuinely invested in their communities. Next slide. Am I cutting out at all, or are we smooth sailing right now? Smooth sailing, amazing. All right, so the two final practices that provided community benefits were helping others out on the water and being a good employer. So farmers gave a ton of examples of helping others, from small things like bringing beach toys that were floating away back to their neighbors, to giving someone a tow or flagging down a lobsterman who lost their gear, like Graham here. One farmer even said that they pulled a kid out of the ice once. So this really helps to build that integrity-based trust with your community members. And then farmers talked about how being a good employer helped them build their reputation and gain trust. So Mitch said, this quote has a big impact, I think, in terms of how you're perceived outside. All right, next slide. So just coming back to this table, building trust for farmers can take many shapes, but generally being community focused in your approach through quality communication, responsible and respectful farm practices, and participating meaningfully in your community at whatever capacity you can, makes a big difference in gaining community support. Before I move on to the final theme of opposition, I just want to point out that the obvious, that this seems like a ton of work for farmers who are already at capacity running their businesses. But I focused on farmers and farmer actions because this is the level where social license work happens. So one farmer called it working the ground game, and I loved that because social license work is really grassroots work. It's these micro interactions that can make the biggest difference. And then over time, with more farms and more farmers doing this type of work, awareness increases, and we might get to the point where aquaculture is incorporated into Maine's identity as a state. And this has major benefits for the industry. Additionally, though it hasn't been monetized yet, social license work also does help build your customer base just through relationship building. So it isn't all preventative work, it can actually pay off. And lastly, there are many organizations working on ways to support farmers in doing this social license work. And we're going to work on compiling these resources, so keep an eye out. Next slide. So unfortunately, social license work isn't a silver bullet. So farmers can do everything right and still face pockets of really tough opposition who have already made up their minds. Social license work definitely reduces this risk, but it doesn't eliminate it. So many of the farmers that participated in this had in fact faced some serious opposition, especially the larger operations. So how did they go about dealing with it? Well, they started with the same approach we've talked about so far. They reached out, had conversations, offered to make accommodations if they were within reason, and were respectful of their concerns. But if folks were unwilling to have that respectful dialogue, or their requests for changes were unreasonable, like asking you to move your entire farm, or just not have a farm at all, farmers agreed that disengaging is best. Don't get caught up in fighting with the opposition if you don't have to. It isn't worth the time or effort. So in lease hearings, where this opposition often comes up and it's unavoidable, farmers said stick to the facts, be transparent and honest, and make sure you've done your homework so you're prepared to answer all questions. Your answers might not change the mind of those opposers, but it might change the minds of those in the audience who are on the fence. So ultimately, rather than combating opposition, focus on building support. So this quote here is from Jody. She'd already made changes based to her farm based on feedback. And she said, quote, there comes a point where it's like, I can't accommodate you people anymore. It's just not working. But she didn't allow that to affect her future interactions with them. So she said, even after that, her husband spent like 4 days helping out one of the opposers fix his water line to their island house. So they kept their reputation intact and put their efforts, focused their efforts on working with local fishermen and reaching out and engaging with anyone who expressed interest. Fiona talked about maintaining their reputation for good character as well when dealing with opposition, saying that they refused to engage in mudslinging and instead opted to, quote, rely on the equity I have had historically for the last 17 years in the community. So instead of getting mired down, fighting the opposition or being defensive, they focused on building support. All right, next slide. So I thought I'd conclude by bringing up a few critiques about social license and talk about how my perceptions have kind of shifted over the course of the project. So the first critique is that there's no practical way of determining what level of social license a company has. So social license has been kind of criticized as being vague. The second critique is the question of who actually issues social license. So we know that there are inequities in participation. So it's often like a loud, well-resourced, educated group of landowners that are driving these opposition campaigns. They have the time, they have the money, and the legal know-how that's often involved in this. So this is a real challenge. I think that these critiques are justified, but I've become really fond of this concept because it's vague. So what I've realized is that Maine farmers are hyper aware of how damaging opposition can be. So they're reacting to this threat even when they aren't experiencing any direct opposition themselves. And so that's exactly how social license can function as a community tool. So the ability to oppose, regardless of who does it, exists, and farmers are becoming better neighbors and community members because of it. And having no way of measuring this support might be actually a benefit because there's no endpoint. So it's really a process. So social license is more of a heuristic for farmers. It's like a way of thinking about genuine community engagement. So for me, rather than thinking about social license as an industry tool or a community tool, I really see it as an important tool for social sustainability that forces the industry to prioritize community-focused practices. And this benefits both sides. So communities get businesses that are invested and responsive, and then farmers get communities that are engaged and supportive. And this is what a socially sustainable industry looks like. Next slide. So just to wrap up, one thing that was clear in this project was that social license is top of mind for Maine farmers, and they're doing social license work every day as a part of their farming. Whether through farm tours or participating in festivals or giving talks in schools, farmers know how important it is to gain community support for their own business and for the broader industry as well. So it was also clear that social license work has major benefits for farmers and for communities. So though it requires a lot of time and effort, social license work can pay off for farmers in gaining of customers, and in the support that's really needed for acquiring a lease or expanding. And it benefits communities because it encourages farmers to be really community focused in their approach. So ultimately, social license as a way of thinking can help us build a more socially sustainable industry here in Maine and beyond. So I'm going to end with this quote here. One more slide, Sydney. This is from Graham. He's one of the oyster farmers that participated in the study. He said, at the end of the day, we're sharing the waters with everybody else. And the coast of Maine is a public good. So you're using a public good, you're renting it, and this is all done with the goodwill of the state. And so much of that is based on the goodwill of the people you're sharing the water with. So if you're not doing your job to engage with the community and develop social license with the stakeholders on whatever body of water you're on, quite frankly, I don't think you should be doing aquaculture. I guess that's it. We're all sharing the water. The sharing part is the important part. And that is what I have for you. As long as you can, I'm tempted to turn my camera back on, but I don't want to. Should I try it?
I say try it. You've been steady so far.
All right. Okay. So I'll take any questions if we have any. I see you all were answering questions as we went along.
You did. I was wondering, maybe we should try and put up some of the resources that you've been developing, just to show what they look like.
Oh, you dare share a screen with me?
I don't know.
We can try it. Let me pull one up. So yeah, we have the infographic series. I just got the final drafts last night, so I will. Which one should we pull up? The summary?
Are they on the website?
So one is on the website. Getting Started is on the website. Maya is our website person, and she is hiking right now, so she's going to put the rest of them up on Monday as soon as she's back. But I can share my screen if you want to see the executive summary.
Yeah, just talk us through the different results, what the different summaries. You've got the executive summary, you're going to have the full report, and then you've got these short versions, right? So maybe you could just talk through what they all are and what each one contains.
Can you see this, or is it distorted? It's good. Okay. So this is the we have the full guide, obviously, but that is it's like probably 40-ish pages long. It's not a hard read at all. It's like I said, it's a lot of quotes. But if you want kind of like a overall summary, we have this. It's I think 6 pages. Our design team agency has been working on these, and they look. I love how they're coming out. So this just goes over, what is social license, why it's important, a little bit about the study. And then through each of the themes that I've covered today, so learning and integrating, engagement through education, and then the trust generating practices, facing opposition, and it has a simplified version of that table. And then a bunch of references too, in case you're really interested in taking a deep dive into social license. I'll share, let me stop sharing this. Stop share. I can go to one of the other ones if you want to see the infographic series are really short. They're a page, and we're going to have those available on the website, but also in paper version for people to grab. So these just are topic specific. Let me share this. Okay. So yeah, this is like social license to operate 101. So if any participants have any ideas or on what could be useful as these little topic specific infographics, I think these are kind of more digestible, and if you're super busy, which everybody is, it's less of a burden to read. So feel free to either email us or put them in the chat, and we can kind of focus in on different topics. We also have talked about creating a sort of worksheet kind of aimed at new farmers who are starting out, kind of like designing or figuring out your stakeholder network. So a worksheet with questions that can kind of guide you to figure out who you need to connect with in your area. So we're also working on something like that. And then, like I said in the presentation too, there are resources out there that different organizations are working on to help farmers, because this is it's a ton of work to do all of this. Like MAA has been working on, I think, like social media, like how to support farmers do their own social media stuff to get their story out there. So things like this. So we've been talking about how we can compile them into maybe a one-pager, just to have those all available. I'll stop this share.
Thanks, Emily. We had one question in the chat asking about if you could speak a little bit to the relationship between regulation and social license.
Yeah, so this has come up in a talk I did recently at GMRI. We were talking about, if these changes that farmers are making would then be incorporated, or the public concerns would then be incorporated into regulations later. So I think that might be kind of a natural progression, like the regulation changes are in response to this public concern balancing act with, what farmers are doing in response to those concerns. So I don't know if I really have a great answer to the question of how exactly they're connected. I mean, social license work is really just this grassroots stuff that farmers are doing, and abiding by regulations is like a bare minimum. So that's part of the social license research in other industries too. It's going beyond these requirements. So meeting the regulations is really just like, I'm credible and legitimate. So that's like the bare minimum of social license is legitimacy. So if you're meeting all of those regulations, abiding by those regulations, then you're meeting that bare minimum, and all the social license work is kind of extra stuff. But I think we'll see how they kind of influence each other too in the future as the industry grows.
We have 3 other comments and questions in the chat just now. One, which I think quickly, is James says, thanks for the ideas, Emily. And he's saying the personal stories from other aquaculture farmers were very helpful and resonate with our own local community and LPA experiences. And I think that's really important part of some of this research, co-production of the material is about validating experiences amongst the farmer community. Can you maybe just talk about that quickly?
Yeah, I mean, it was a really important part of the research design for this project. Like I said, I'm a land farmer, and I've done a lot of research in social license in aquaculture too, but farmers are the ones that are doing this work on a daily basis. So there's a lot of nuance that you can't get from just like reading what has been written before about social license. So yeah, that was really important, and this wouldn't have been possible without all of the, it took time out of the farmers. It takes time to do interviews and to read through these documents. So it's a lot of work for farmers too, but I'm really glad that it was helpful. And I think in a way it makes it more legitimate that it's coming from other farmers doing the work than it is just coming from, a researcher.
And it's good to know that farmers aren't alone.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another question here is from Paul, and there was a lot of focus and good advice on building relationships with the working waterfront. It seems most opposition is now coming from shorefront owners. Could you speak a bit about that? Yeah,
so this comes up super often. I think, I'm not sure, I don't have the data to confidently say that is where most of the opposition is coming from, but that is the most successful opposition that I think we're seeing. So again, it's a lot of folks that are living on the coast that are retired, they have a lot of time, they have, they've had careers, and like some of them are lawyers. So a lot of the tactics that are used to slow or stop farms from coming in are like through lawsuits. And those seem to be like, that seems like it's the primary tactic, aside from, I guess, the moratoriums, which are coming out. So yeah, I think that thinking about social license work and dealing with that stakeholder group specifically, it's really about, it's the basic stuff, like finding ways to connect with that stakeholder group that is meaningful. And I think that that's why farmers have had so much success using their product to connect with a lot of riparian landowners, because oysters specifically are really, they're like a high status food, and people really enjoy them. So that's like a real benefit. So it's finding those benefits for the folks that aren't really benefiting in other ways from like the job creation. So yeah, from a social license perspective, that's really, it's going back to the basics, but I think that we do need to do a lot more research on what groups are able to successfully drive social license as that actually affects the outcome of lease hearings. So, I mean, the DMRs, you have to meet the 10 requirements. So you can't just go into a lease hearing and say, like, I don't want to look at this farm. Like, they have to use these other channels to kind of successfully oppose lease hearings. So I think that the jury's still out on whether or not these landowners are the ones that are driving the narrative, or if they're just the ones that we're hearing about because they're having success with these lawsuits. So social license is really about, it's about majority support, and it's really hard to say whether you have majority support when you're just looking at your community. You're not, having a vote or anything. But there's a lot of research to support that these, well-resourced, small, loud groups are really are creating a lot of noise and dominating that kind of narrative. But whether they're actually having success all the time, I don't know if that's actually been well studied. So more studies on that, and we'll have more information.
Yeah, and I think similar answer might be for the Bob's asking, any tips on how to deal with the well-funded, organized anti-aquaculture groups? Seems like once they get together, there is no way to win hearts and minds.
Yeah, so I think the strength of thinking about it with a social license framework is, and Annie and I were talking about this earlier, it's all about being proactive. So being on the defensive and fighting opposition that has already changed their minds, it's not a good look. And there's also, there's research out of Canada that kind of tracked companies facing opposition and like what they did and what was effective and not effective. And so there is some research to back that up, that being on the defenses is bad for the industry. So it's really, I think, like anticipating and going in beforehand. So you're the one that's filling these knowledge gaps rather than the anti-aquaculture groups. And so that's the key part. Like with the moratoriums in Maine, where they haven't been successful is when local farmers are there to kind of talk about aquaculture in their communities, and or where people are already familiar with aquaculture because of those local farms. So yeah, it's really kind of getting ahead. So I think figuring out how to get ahead is really key.
And sorry to leave this one to last, Adrian, but since it was a shift, I left it till the end. So this is shifting a little bit. Do you think the recommendations set out in this guide would change for other types of aquaculture, such as RAS or offshore?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think there's the social license stuff that's very basic, like communication and honesty, and all of that is transferable across industries. But there would be different recommendations for, like the operational practices. And that's what we found. That's what was so interesting to me about this project, was that there are really specific things that shellfish and seaweed farmers are doing that, RAS, like, I don't know how, maybe it would be effective if they had, like a salmon and they brought it to their neighbors. So we'll have to see about that. But for offshore and RAS, I think that it probably would be different when you get to those kind of like micro practices that farmers are doing. But big picture, communication, honesty, transparency, that's all going to apply no matter what industry that you're looking at. But it would be really interesting to see, to follow up and look at how that plays out differently.